happy that you're here. We're going to be talking today about affordable housing. Affordable housing is a piece of a project that we're working on now. We've been working on it for 2 years. It's the Advanced Planning Initiative. And there's been quite a bit of public outreach during the process. We've learned many things already. We're very excited that the developers are here to talk to us about how to build affordable housing. But with what we've learned so far from the community in terms of all of our outreach efforts is we've learned that people who have lived here, raised their families here, actually want to downsize and there's nowhere to go. People who grew up here want a first-time home buyer opportunity, and that doesn't really exist. St. Mary's students need housing. And we are looking at where the housing should go, and it's pretty much been determined that it needs to be focused in Moraga Center and Green Center. So it's been a great process. We've had multiple council work sessions and study sessions, and we've received direction from the town council to move forward with a 10% affordable housing inclusionary policy. And the reason for the meeting today is, well, we've been having lots of conversations with the developers. We really wanted to invite them here to talk about what are some of the important elements to consider, because we want to make sure that whatever our policy is economically viable and that housing can be developed. So we're really thankful that you're here. We have a couple council members here, Councilmember Teresa Noda and Mike McClure, who are here. The other council members are not here because otherwise it would be a Brown Act violation, so we're recording the meeting. So the other 3 council members will absolutely be listening because they're really interested in what you have to say. We also have our Planning Commission Chair, Carrie Hillis, as well as Marcus Bodie and Nick Polsky from the Planning Commission here, and I'm sure the other planning commissioners will be listening as well. So, thank you again for being here, and thank you to Afshad. Afshad Hamid is our planning director. She's been managing this advanced planning initiative that's really kind of setting the vision for what future development in Moraga will look like. So, take it away, Afshad.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, and thank you and welcome, and thank you for helping me pull this off. This is an important piece of the conversation and part of the outreach. So I'm really grateful that all our development community is here this morning. Before we get started, I just want to tell you a little bit about the format of what we're going to do. We're going to make brief introductions. We're going to go around the table and you'll introduce yourselves. You'll state your name, what company you're with, and what your interest is in Moraga. And then Barry Miller and myself will make a brief 10-minute PowerPoint presentation to set the context. At the end, we have very specific questions that we would like feedback on. And we will be going around the table and asking you for your feedback. At the end, the audience, I'm sure, has a lot of questions. So you can fill out the index cards and put those questions, and then Barry and I will help monitor those and get those questions moving. I just want to give a big shout out to the planning staff that's here and also to the Parks and Rec staff that helped us. So Jasmine Bates, thank you so much for all your assistance. Brian Horn, he is our our senior planner. So he just got a promotion and we're just so excited for him. Mio Mendez and Susie Millie with us, and we have Mr. Millie helping us with audio and video this morning. So we have a lot of local talent. So my name is Afshad Hamid. I'm the planning director. I've been with the town for 2+ years, but I bring over 20 years of experience, and 10 of those years have been in the East Bay. I've worked in various cities, so I have a rich and varied background in not just planning, but also getting projects from start to finish. And I'm going to turn it to Barry to introduce himself.
Oh, sure. I'm Barry Miller, just standing out in the spotlight here. And I'm the consulting project manager working with Afsha on the project. As you might imagine, a project of this size and complexity involves a big team, and we're doing a complete, comprehensive EIR for the project. So there are other members of the consulting team who aren't here, but it's Bay Area Economics and Rincon Consultants and Fair and Peers and Aaron Welch Planning. And what we're doing is the housing up level. We'll introduce ourselves in the slide in terms of what the project entails, so I'll save it for that. But I'm a local planning consultant and have been doing long-range planning for about 35 years, primarily in the East Bay, but in other parts of the country as well. Nice to meet everybody.
And I'm going to start first with Lois. You want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi everyone, I'm Lois List. I'm an Associate Director at Union Housing. Nice to meet everyone.
I'm Eric Chevalier, one of the principals at the Atlas Company. We are a developer in the East Bay with a focus on the 24-680 corridor.
And I understand that you're currently doing something in the town of Danville.
We're doing several projects in the town of Danville, Walnut Creek, and another market outside of the Bay Area, all multifamily mixed use.
Hi, I'm Peter Saliano. I'm the Vice President of Business Development at Penn Housing. We are a nonprofit affordable housing developer and property management company.
I'm Jay Kerner, and I'm the owner of U.S. Realty Partners. We're a shopping center owner-operator on the West Coast and Hawaii, and we're also the owners of the Union Valley Shopping Center.
I'm Stefan Schnitzler. I'm in-house counsel at Brandon Development. We're a local fourth-generation builder and developer based out of Lafayette.
Hi, I'm Nikhil Dera. I am a property owner in Morocco on School Street. I'm a developer. I have a project in Lafayette. I've got a couple of projects in San Francisco. My wife grew up in Morocco, which is what brought me here. I live in Lafayette.
I'm David Berzoni. I represent my family, the Berzoni family. We're property owners here in Moraga and Lafayette, and we're interested in developing some nice projects, and hopefully we could streamline it and expedite it and take out all the constraints and provide some nice affordable housing, a lot of it via ADUs. So
Thank you, Dave.
You're excited about that.
Thank you.
I'm Patrick Carew, VP for Strategic Partnerships at St. Mary's College, and we are the owner of that Marine property there. And we are very much looking for the opportunity to develop that and to work with the town for the low-cost housing as well. I think it would be a great partnership with St. Mary's College, and we're very interested in this.
Well, thank you so much. And we're just going to get started, and like I said, it's going to be brief. I just want to set the context for what's happening in Moraga. So, what we want to cover today is what is the Advanced Planning Initiative, because it's a lot, and I want to explain what that means. And then we're going to go into the proposed policies that our council and our planning commission and our community has already provided input on. We want to focus specifically on inclusionary zoning this morning. And then we are going to open it up mostly for an hour for the developer feedback. And then we'll give you some next steps. So we start really with our general plan. It's really the most important document that we have. Our general plan was adopted in 2002, and there are some really key things that we are focusing on. Quality of housing options, a community so that our children, seniors, and local workforce can continue to call Moraga home. And then we also take pride in our community and our semi-rural setting, and well-maintained homes. This also means creating focal points in the Moraga Shopping Center and exploring appropriate locations and densities to meet the region's fair share of housing needs, and responding to low and moderate income households, the local workforce, seniors, and empty nesters. So our regional housing needs allocation, RHNA, is 1,118 units for the town of Moraga. 501 of those have to be low income. And it's broken down into 4 categories, 318 for very low, 183 for low income, 172 for moderate income, and 445 for above moderate. So what is the Comprehensive Advanced Planning Initiative? It encompasses our housing element. And I'm sure all of you are aware that our housing element has to be adopted by January 31st, 2023. And it's on an 8-year cycle, and it's a mandate by the state. So in September 2021, the town kicked off what's called a Comprehensive Advanced Planning Initiative, and it includes the housing element, the general plan amendments, which includes consistencies, the safety element and circulation, the Bollinger Canyon rezone, a program level EIR, and then after we adopt the housing element, we plan to do the zoning and objective standards to implement the housing element. So our draft housing element, which our council reviewed in July, and it was submitted to HCD in August, it includes an inclusionary zoning policy. And today what we're seeking is feedback from developers on the framework. And once we get that framework, we plan to bring that policy to the Planning Commission on November 7th, and then to Council on November 16th. So I'm going to let Barry take it from here.
Great,
Barry.
thanks. So one of the things that we do as part of the housing element update is what's called a constraints analysis. This is required by state law. We have to evaluate all of the obstacles to building housing in our community. Both governmental constraints, which are things like our zoning regulations and our fees and our processing practices, and non-governmental constraints, which are things we really can't control, like the price of lumber or the cost of land or the shortage of labor. So both of these analyses were completed as part of this process, and there were a number of changes that have been proposed to our zoning regulations and map as a result of that analysis. That includes increasing the allowable density in our multifamily zone and mixed use areas from 20 units per acre to 24 units per acre. Rezoning a few parts of the town where the zoning was commercial only, in other words, it did not allow for residential uses, to make it explicit that multifamily housing and mixed use development with housing would be permitted in the future. And then adoption of objective design and development standards, which essentially is a tool for streamlining projects that conform to certain design standards that the town identifies as necessary, and allowing what we call by right development. In other words, this is an expedited process for projects to be approved, limited number of hearings and so forth for projects that meet the standards. We didn't propose changes to the height limit because it's 45 feet currently. In many communities, they have a 35-foot height limit, but because we have a 45-foot height limit, that accommodates what is basically 4-story development, which is, I think, about as high as you can go with the densities that we're looking at. I just wanted to touch on parking because we've heard from our individual interviews with various folks, including some of the ones around this table, that parking is a really critical part of making a project pencil out. Currently, the town of Moraga requires 2 parking spaces per unit, regardless of the bedroom count per unit type, except in the R20 multifamily district. And we also have a requirement of 1 guest parking space per every 2 housing units, or 0.5 per unit. There is a proposal in the housing element to reduce the parking standards in the Ream Park and Moraga Center areas to something that's more in line with what is in our multifamily district, which would be a benefit, and we can come back to that during our Q&A. As part of this project, as Afsha mentioned, we're doing some rezoning, and I won't go into detail about what's being shown on this map, just to say that The areas that are in various colors are proposed for an increase in density to 24 units per acre. In the case of the red, actually the red does allow residential, but the purple area and the very light blue area are in zones that don't currently allow housing that would be changed to a zone that does permit housing. And this is the Moraga Center area. And I will say, I think most of you are familiar with this, but there's a Moraga Center specific plan that was done for this area about a decade ago, and there is relatively new zoning in place for the properties in this area. In the Ream Center, which is a smaller area geographically, but has a great deal of potential, a lot of this area is underused office buildings, parking areas, and so forth. We are proposing allowing housing in actually the area where the town offices are and across the street from there. That's an area that's currently zoned for office and in a zoning district that doesn't currently permit housing. And then most of the Ream Shopping Center would be changed from community commercial to a mixed-use district that allows housing at 24 units per acre. And again, if there are questions, we can come back. I'm going to shift for the last couple of slides to inclusionary zoning. As Afsha mentioned, the town did allow us to include a policy in the general plan housing element to pursue an inclusionary housing ordinance, given that almost half of our assignment from the state is to plan for low-income housing. We're not going to get there without some trigger for making sure that our market rate development includes at least some affordable units. So what this ordinance would do is require a percentage of units within future market rate projects to be set aside for either low or moderate income households. In exchange for that ask from the development community, we would be offering density bonuses and waivers of certain development standards. So this is not only a tool to help us meet our regional housing needs allocation, or RENA, but also a way to create affordable units in different locations and make sure that we are not clustering all of our lower income or affordable housing in one location. Basically, we're spreading the affordable units throughout the town and market rate projects. This may sound like a new concept, but in fact 90% of the jurisdictions in Contra Costa County either already have inclusionary zoning ordinances or they've included it in their housing elements. So there's only a handful of cities, and actually we don't know about Martinez, they haven't done their housing element yet, so they may be looking at this too, but you can see most have already done this or are planning on it. When you don't have to memorize this chart, it's not an eye test, but what this is basically showing you is that when you include affordable units in a development project, under state law, you're entitled to get a bonus in terms of the number of units you build. Again, it's called the state density bonus. And you can see on this chart, if you set aside 10% of all of the units in your development for lower income households, you are entitled to a 20% density bonus. In other words, a 20% increase in the number of housing units that you can build in your project. So that's state law, and we do anticipate that that would be used by developers in implementing this policy. So we had a work session in August with the town council and went through all of the variables that go into coming up with an inclusionary housing ordinance, and came up with some general agreement on some of the parameters. So one is that we would look at a 10% percentage requirement. There are some cities that have 15 or 20%. San Francisco has even higher than 20%. That we would be having different income groups targeted for sale projects versus for rent projects because of the cost differential. That we would allow ADUs, accessory dwelling units, in lieu of affordable units, or I should say deed-restricted affordable units, in single-family areas. If 25% of the units were set aside, were to include ADUs, those ADUs would not have deed restrictions on them. They'd be market rate units that we assume would be affordable by design. Projects with less than 5 units would be exempt. We are looking at developing a fee schedule for what we call fractional units. So if you have a project and you multiply it by 10%, and you end up with a number like 2.4 that you know, what do you do with the, you can't build 0.4 of a housing unit, so that converts to a fee. In most cases, that's to be developed in the future. To provide an alternate means of compliance for a developer who is not able to provide the affordable units on site, including allowing off-site units or acquiring an existing apartment building in town and converting it to affordable, or donating land to a nonprofit affordable housing developer. The design of the units, there was agreement that they should be roughly the same design as the market rate units, that you shouldn't be able to look at a project and say, aha, that's the affordable unit. So that they would blend, but that they could be slightly smaller in floor area. 55-year term of affordability if it was a rental unit, and a 45-year if it was a for sale unit. That this would apply town-wide, but that the parameter there is that we would allow ADUs in single-family areas in lieu of the below-market units, and that we would rely on the state density bonus for the incentives. There was some interest in both the Planning Commission and Town Council in identifying, well, what are the waivers and concessions that we can offer, what we would like to offer. And in the 3-minute time period at a council meeting where any developer can comment, we really couldn't dig deep enough and get that level of feedback that we need to answer that question. So that's a lot of why we're here today, is to move on to these questions. So I'm going to go through the questions, then we're going to actually turn off the projector and ask you guys to weigh in on some of these questions. So this one is for Louis. The first question is really for Louis and Felix specifically, who both are with nonprofits, is what would it take to do a 100% affordable housing project in Moraga? And I think we do want to spend a little bit of time hearing from you about that. And then really the other questions are for everyone. Have you used the state density bonus law in other communities? What takeaways can you share? What works well? What kinds of incentives or concessions are most helpful in those other places? And any specific feedback or suggestions for the town and its planners and its elected and appointed officials on the various issues that you see here on the screen. And it's a little bit of an open-ended question. If you see things not on this list that you think are important to bring up, please do. Densities, so what does it take to get a project built? What's the density you're looking for? Parking standards, what kind of parking standards should we be looking at? Are our height limits reasonable? The setbacks that are in our, and I know not all of you may be intimately familiar with our setbacks, but we can, Afsha and I can share information as requested, but we're kind of looking to see to what extent that's a factor. The open space requirements, lot coverage limits or floor area ratio limits, the design standards. One of the things that we're doing in this process is we're preparing fairly detailed standards for, at least for the Ream Park area, in order to expedite projects. So we want to make sure that those standards are going to work for your projects. And then any other development standards. This is the last slide, just to, if you've worked in other cities with inclusionary housing requirements, any advice you'd like to share with the town of Moraga as we develop our ordinance, which we're doing right now and we're hoping to roll out in just a few weeks. And then the last question is, what policies would make it easier to incorporate affordable housing as part of a market rate development? And this is not just standards, but the timelines, the processes, and things of that nature, other incentives that the town could provide. So we're going to stop there. I think the questions that were up on the screen are in a printed handout that we emailed, but we made, I think, maybe, are those copies of them?
Yes.
Yeah. So we'll pass that on as well. We're using them as a prop for the projector. But now that we've completed this, I think we'll move on.
And I think we can turn the projector off.
Do that.
Neil will get it.
Okay.
Yeah. So the first question that we want to go through is really, as we said, for the affordable housing developers that are here today. And we would like to understand, and I'm going to call on Felix and Louis, but I know Patrick Carew in his introduction also mentioned housing for faculty and staff and maybe some affordable component. So I think it would be great to hear from you as well on that. So the first question is, what would it take to do 100% affordable housing in Malaga? And I'll start with Felix because you're to my left.
Okay. Louis, feel free to jump in. This is a big question. And I think I would start with just that affordable housing, as Eden and Penn work on them, is a substantially different approach or financing stack than market rate housing. And we rely on a number of public subsidies to make things work, because the cost to us to build the apartment unit is the same as or higher than a market rate developer, right? So we have to hire the same contractors, go through the same permitting process, build the same quality product, and usually because of the public subsidies, we also have prevailing wage requirements on the labor side. So our costs per unit tend to be very similar or higher than a market rate developer. On the other side, though, we are charging much lower rents, right? Because these are income-restricted homes. And so our tenants are income qualified, and they pay roughly 30% of their income for the rent, which makes there to be a big difference between what we charge and what the market rate is charging. Hence the affordable housing, that component of it. So you have the same cost and reduced revenue over time, and therefore we cannot leverage the same kind of investment or financing on the debt side that a market rate development can. So instead, 100% affordable housing have to rely on public subsidies in different forms, and the biggest one of which is low-income housing tax credits. That has two different pots in the state. It's allocated from the feds and then distributed at the state level. There's two different types of it. Both are competitive right now, and roughly it takes out about 40 to 55% of your total development cost. So you can think of it as like about half of your building is paid for, essentially through tax credits, depending on which side you go. So that means the rest of it has to be either permanent debt, which again, in our case, is usually very small, or it's going to be local subsidies from either the city, the county, or the state. So ballpark, really super rough. That gap is probably on the order of $300,000 to $350,000 per unit. And in other jurisdictions, that's kind of distributed between the city and the state and the county. So if you split it 3 ways, then you're looking at about $100,000 or $120,000 per jurisdiction in terms of their contribution toward the project. And in return, I think those come in the form of really, really long residual receipts loan. And in return, we restrict that property essentially for a very long time. And tenants in those buildings have the certainty that their rents aren't going to go up with the market, and that they're paying an amount that they can actually afford to live in that place. And what we've seen, when that's coupled with great property management and resident services, what we've seen is that provides a huge amount of stability for those families. They don't have to move from apartment to apartment for different reasons. The apartments are kept in really great shape. Kids can grow up in one school district with their friends and have a very stable kind of livelihood that other people can enjoy as well. So, I don't know.
Great.
Okay.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. That's definitely a lot to understand and a lot to And I do have a question, but I'm going to let Louis speak first. And Louis is with Eden Housing. So,
Well, thanks again for having me here, and thank you very much, Felix, for giving Affordable Housing Finance 101 lecture. Really important foundation, but the first thing that we look for is really, ideally a community that wants to work together. And we're so happy to be here and be with a community that's interested and really, bringing on a project like this and collaborating, because that's the first and foremost, most important thing. And then, as Felix alluded to, we have our different kind of stools of the legs of the financing stool, and one of them is this, issue of being able to fill what we call the gap. So, we have our tax credits, we have our mortgage, and then we have the gap. And that's where we have to really collaborate to figure out how can we design a project that's going to have a gap that can be filled and also be viable. So I wanted to just run through some things I wrote down for me when I'm looking for a site, what I look for. Felix, hold your ears because we compete. So first, I like a project that's at least 50 units. So for us, that's where you start to be able to pay for the fixed costs of property management. You are able to amortize some of the fixed costs of the transaction, which are really expensive. I see an affordable finance lawyer in here nodding, knowing how expensive it is to do these transactions. And that's when we start to really have the economies of scale to be able to create a community that's viable. So that's first. Second, we look at a location. These competitive funding sources that we tap into and use to leverage any kind of local money that's available. They want to incentivize people building on sites that are close to amenities that are useful for residents. The good news is I took a look at the two kind of town center areas, and they have some great amenities, so that's another good news. The other thing that the state has been looking for a lot recently ties into this affirmatively furthering fair housing issue that everyone is kind of working on, which is for projects to be located in areas that are called high opportunity. So this is places where affordable housing has traditionally not been built, where there is really well-funded schools and other types of amenities that traditionally residents of affordable housing have had less access to. And then the last ingredient, which is arguably the most important, is how am I going to find land? So as Felix mentioned, we have all of these different sources that we tap into, and we have a gap. The cost of building the building costs the same as market rate, but then we have this issue of land. So which is sort of this extra cost. So ideally, we find a site that we don't have to pay for, and we can go and we can work with the state and the community to pay for the construction costs. However, this is not always the case. So if we're going to be working with a private landowner to make an acquisition, then the state funding that's available and the tax credits, there's not always a lot extra left to pay for a lot of land. So that's really where the partnership with the local community, be it the county or the city or the town, comes in. And that's kind of what in this thing. I'm sure. Great.
I'd like to turn to Patrick, because we really want to hear from one of our biggest employers in the town, and we're really vested with St. Mary's. So I'd like to hear a little bit from you on what you're looking for in terms of getting a project kicked off.
Thank you, and glad to be here, glad to hear about all of this. Great information for us. I think you know that we own that Ream Center where the grocery store used to be, and we've turned that into our Ream campus at St. Mary's College. And we feel as though there is an opportunity there. And what I heard from taking good notes here, that it's underutilized. You go over there and you see parking spaces that aren't used. it's on one level, so there is an opportunity for that piece of land to have a higher usage. We're very fortunate to be in partnership with the town of Moraga. We think that this is a really good idea, from our board of directors to our president to the people in facilities. So everybody that I am partnering with and working with at St. Mary's College feels as though this is a good idea. We're at the very beginning of exploring how to do this. What's the highest and best use of this land, so that we can help meet the subsidies and the regulations that are needed with the town of Moraga, and how will it help in a very positive way with the housing with St. Mary's College. We think about the multi-use scenario where, we're thinking about a nursing school that could possibly be on the first floor. That's just an example. You could have some sort of use on that first floor. You could then go multi-housing up as high as you possibly can. And who would utilize this housing? There's the market rate within the town, but we have faculty, we have staff, we have undergraduate, we have graduate students that I believe there's a portion of that that would significantly qualify for the low to moderate income housing. So I think there's a big opportunity there, and it's great to hear, Louis, what you're saying, and Felix, what you're saying, as to, how does this work? How do we partner with that? And then there comes the, practical application of how do you pencil this out, right? How do you make this work? How can it be an advantage to the people that need the housing? How can it be positive for St. Mary's College? And how can it be positive for the community and for the town of Moraga and for the county, the state, and even if there's federal subsidies here. We absolutely want to work with everybody to see how we can really maximize that and partner with everybody as we can push this forward and explore it. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. It's really insightful. I want to move on to the next set of questions, and really the next set of questions is for the entire roundtable. And have you used the state density bonus law in your projects in other communities? And what takeaways can you share about what works well and what doesn't? What incentives or concessions were most helpful? And I'll call on Nikhil first, if that's okay.
That's fine. I actually have not used state density bonuses anywhere. But my San Francisco projects have both had inclusive housing. And the thing I would point out which was useful through the pandemic is, so by way of background, it was a 24-unit building which had 3 units which were affordable. We were developing them as condominiums. Through the pandemic, we wanted to maintain flexibility, and San Francisco provides for the developer choice going in to have on-site housing or pay an in-lieu fee. So when we got it approved, we got it approved for on-site housing. But through the pandemic, we figured out we need flexibility. We don't know where the market's going to go. We may or may not be able to sell these, and if we allocate 3 units as condominiums, as affordable housing, then our hands are tied and we no longer have flexibility. Through the pandemic, we came up with the money to buy in-lieu housing, to pay for in-lieu housing instead, which gave us the flexibility, and we've now switched over to a rental building. So the point I'm making is, as a developer, going in, we have to be able to quantify our risks and risk mitigate, and that flexibility is important. Because I don't know where our project would be today if I had 3 units which were assigned to affordable housing units. I'd be running the HOA, spending all of that money, while I'm unable to sell the other ones because the market is not absorbing those units today in San Francisco. So just one point. I have other points about other things, but from a state density bonus usage perspective, that's what I haven't used it, but I'm considering it for a couple of projects in forward.
Jay, would you like to opine in here on the state density bonus law?
But there's not much that I can really add there, and mostly because we are, as far as being developers and operators, we're mostly in the shopping center business.
Yeah.
We do have experience in multifamily, but it's been mostly buying existing. We have entitled a couple of projects in the past, but they were market rate. We did not have any density bonus negotiations.
It's fair. Dave, I'd like to hear from you about the state density bonus law.
Right.
Well, specifically about projects where you've implemented it.
Okay, so I'm not getting the feeling that you're limiting me on what I can talk about, but I have provided affordable units via ADUs, and I think we found here in our community that that is a positive aspect, and of providing an affordability component, especially when we were building smaller units, and whether they're fully enclosed in an existing house or a new house. I have not worked on any condo or townhouse projects, but I've seen examples where they've had ADUs that you can rent, that the townhouse owner can rent out if he wants to. So I think if we elaborate a little bit more on flexibility and create a incentive program that allows people to build and transfer, development rights and or below market rate rights amongst, different parties, that will facilitate. I am against inclusionary housing. It is a significant cost, and it puts a chilling effect on the creation of new housing, and also affordable housing. A lot of times, affordable housing can be more expensive. Although ADUs is an avenue of creating affordable housing that can be dispersed around the town, and in a lot of instances, in my case, it's a cheaper way for me to provide affordable housing. So I've provided affordable housing via ADUs. I have not had an affordable housing rental project, but I do have some proposals in front of the town where I can include that. But I want to be clear, I'm against inclusionary housing unless you get it right. And there are a lot of examples where it's been done inappropriately, and it creates an additional constraint or barrier to producing affordable housing. So I'm more for creating incentives via concessions or waivers or added density bonuses or different things that the town can add in as incentives. So I'm more for the carrot and less of the stick. I don't want the stick because more stick is more expensive, is more delay, and is more constraint.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate your honesty. I'd like to move around the room a little bit. Eric, can you give us some thoughts on using the density bonus law?
Yes, we've actually pulled a density bonus card, and other times we've looked at projects where we've evaluated density bonus, and it did not work for us economically, simply because just because it's there to be had doesn't always mean it works. And Barry mentioned earlier, parking is always a driver. And especially when you're doing mixed use, high density, getting more units doesn't always work because it may force you to a lower level of parking garage, more costs, so on and so forth. So it really becomes a performer exercise very early on to determine, does it make sense? So yes, we've done it. We've done it down in Peninsula or Los Altos markets. We've looked at it in other markets, and it just doesn't work for us. And that's just for us. But it's an economic driver more than anything else. The concessions that we've received in that market were height and parking. We got parking reductions. In other cases, applying those two sometimes works, sometimes it does not work. So it's really, every site's different, every municipality is different. They all have a slightly different playbook, for lack of a better word. So you have to assess it side by side.
Yeah, this is Thanks, Eric. And I think we're going to move on to the next question, which is kind of the big, oh, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I've got probably a little bit of a different perspective on state density bonus.
Sure. Please.
A lot of other folks. So I view it as probably one of, if not the strongest kind of tool in a developer's tool belt these days. We use it on virtually every one of our projects. Most of the jurisdictions we work in, you're already qualified for it off the bat, because as your chart showed, 90% of the local jurisdictions have adopted inclusionary housing zone ordinances. Most of those ordinances, just by complying with the city's local requirements, put you in a density bonus. Anyways, so you might as well get some quote unquote free benefits from that. If you're already providing that affordable housing, so if you can get concessions, which are kind of their own concessions and waivers are kind of legal terms of art and their own separate standards. So the concessions relate to, they have to be something that provides an actual identifiable cost reduction for the project, which legal pundits would say includes not just cost reductions, but generally anything that betters the economics for the project as a whole. And I know there's talk about whether the city tries to kind of specify or maybe steer concessions really for developers. Essentially, the local jurisdictions have to grant more or less any concession the developer asks for that meets that minimum standard that provides actual identifiable cost reductions for the provision of affordable housing. So you can certainly try to steer it, but and I know some cities try to say, well, and they try to incentivize that by saying, well, look, if you pick off our menu, you'll get reviewed at a lower level of review, whether it's staff level or planning commission, rather than having to go to city council. So I think that kind of creating that menu, if that's the route the town wants to go, is helpful. Waivers are basically, for any project that qualifies for that density bonus, the local jurisdiction is prohibited from enforcing any development standard that would physically preclude construction of the project as proposed, and those are unlimited. So basically, if you need to get to a certain height or a certain setback to get the units you're allowed for in the density bonus, you get to do it, kind of a thing. So it's, to me, it's super helpful. Parking standards, like I almost kind of ignore most jurisdictions' local parking standards, unless it happens to be a place where they're more permissive. But under state density bonus, so you're proposing two spaces here for 2 to 3 bedrooms. State density bonus law is a space and a half inclusive of guests. So in most kind of suburban jurisdictions, the parking requirements are going to be lower, just complying with state density bonus law, than the city's requirements. And you don't have to take additional. A lot of times, the value of state density bonus is not additional units; it's those concessions and waivers and the reduced parking standards. So you can really you don't have to take additional units. To do that, if you provide the affordable, you get those regardless. So if parking is your issue, and you have to satisfy the city's minimum inclusionary anyways, you might as well use that to get your parking down. As far as I don't know if you're thinking about just entirely relying on state density bonus law as far as the kind of the incentives to provide that housing, or whether or not the town is inclined to provide some additional potential benefits. I think for most developers, certainty is always better. So I would say arguably under the law, I think it's generally pretty clear, but if it was in writing in the city's code, it'd be a lot easier. Like, if it said more or less like, well, you get a waiver, if you're entitled to a 20% density bonus, your FAR goes up by 20%. Like if the city or the town would make that abundantly clear, that certainly helps up front. Your FAR, essentially your whole building envelope should more or less increase by the same percentage increase in your unit density. Those sort of things I think would help. Any sort of streamlining the town would be willing to offer for those projects. I think would probably be one of the biggest benefits state density bonus doesn't really help you, you know, too much on that sort of issue.
And I apologize, I didn't put a card
Sorry,
up for you, but do you want to
I'm
introduce
filling in for
yourself?
Matt Brand.
Okay. And you're with the,
Brand development. Here.
thank you. And I was hearing some nods over here, so did you guys want to jump in and say something?
I know we're, a lot of the details we're going to cover later, but just so everybody knows, the density bonus, state density bonus law and state environmental streamlining law, SB 35, as a pair, are hugely critical for the work that affordable housing developers do. You know, we are working on a crisis, and if we think a site is going to take you know, the better part of a decade to get a general plan amendment, we're going to work elsewhere. So we like to go into communities and meet objective standards whenever possible, and the density bonus gives us the, you know, just that little extra bit we need here and there to pull at the margins and make a viable project fit, and make sure that our path to approval is predictable and in a reasonable timeline. And these laws were really written to, you know, there's the whole table of how much affordable you're doing, but once you get to 100% affordable, they really are written to help us do our job.
We were segueing into that more detailed question about the development standards, and just to kind of, you know, we had a list on the screen on one of our slides with a whole bunch of, you know, all the variables that our zoning regulations cover. So we had density, parking, setbacks, open space requirements, height, and floor area ratio and lot coverage. I think I memorized them.
And objective standards.
Objective standards.
And we were also opening it up for any other
Right.
standards or development standards that you think, or specific requirements that would work as well.
So, and I think here we're looking for your experiences, if you have had experiences working in Moraga or in other communities, any advice or thoughts you wanted to share with us on the, you know, the way to handle some of those development standards and where we might be able to do better or make it easier to accommodate the projects you're building. And this is sort of a, you know, irrespective of inclusionary and density bonus, but just where can we get it, make it better than it is now.
So I'll make a comment about the parking, which you have reduced, and everybody acknowledges that that's the fundamental thing you build up from. Having reduced the parking is one thing. I think you should also look at what the code says for parking. I'll be specific here. So Moraga code says the drive aisles need to be 28 feet. Lafayette is 26. The length of the parking space here is 19 feet. Everywhere else is 16 or 18. Now, if I add those few feet, if I have a double-loaded podium parking, I'm adding 5 or 6 feet to the width of the building, which then gets built all the way up, which increases my costs. So it's one thing to reduce the parking count, but you should always also make sure that the parking sizing is appropriate and not what's left over from the past when you had lots of open space and it wasn't designed for an indoor podium.
I'll jump in. Obviously, I've been going back and forth with staff with a lot of those issues, parking issues. When we start considering density bonus, then we start having difficulty achieving you know, the proper number of parking spaces. So, you know, I'm not really getting, you know, if I'm getting more units, but I can't park them. And then we kind of go back and forth with staff saying, okay, well, how do we lessen a lot of constraints? So we're not only talking about parking and the widths of roadways, but also shared parking. Some of the existing rules that we have on the R20 district allows a substantial discount if we provide a permanent share car. So you know, we get 25% less. But then again, you know, comparing the parking rules with Lafayette. Lafayette has lower standards, and I was saying, well, why don't we have lower standards? But as Stefan was saying, well, when we start getting into concessions, you know, we can change all the, so parking has always been a big deal. We've spent a lot of time going back and forth saying, hey, we own adjacent property or we have a deal with a neighbor, we can work something out, and you say, no, the code doesn't allow that. And then that's when we start getting into, are we implementing new constraints? And as we go down the road here with the density bonus ordinance, which the town has got to enact, and whether or not we're going with an inclusionary housing, and if we are going with inclusionary housing, I want it to be voluntary. I want it to be voluntary with incentives and bonuses that says, okay, you know, we're not going to force inclusionary housing on you, but we'll give you more benefits. But contingent upon all that is getting rid of the existing constraints. And we spent a lot of time talking about and itemizing the existing constraints. So, you know, and all of these things are existing constraints, and we've talked about them when we implemented the Moraga specific plan, saying, you're implementing constraints. Don't do that because it makes it difficult for everybody coming. So all of these things are constraints. FAR is a big constraint. One of the big constraints is if you're zoning for a certain density, if your development standards don't allow you to achieve that underlying gross density, then all of those are constraints. So, you know, like I said, density bonus is one thing. Waiving and getting concessions and waivers, that, from my perspective, is a big bonus for developers. But frankly, we should be able to work with the town and say, hey, let's cut out these constraints, let's get to the nuts and bolts. If we want to produce affordable housing, how do we incentivize the developers here to provide affordable housing? And that includes ADUs.
Just, I'd like to add on to what David was saying as far as specifically with respect to parking, because that's, you know, every site is different. You know, we all have constraints with all of these things that we talked about, and it's like a Rubik's Cube, right? Trying to get them all to align so that you can have your project be successful. And in our case, you know, we've been looking very closely at parking requirements and thinking through, well, how do we deal with our site constraints, right? Because we have an existing retail project that has all kinds of other things going on around it that can't be changed. So we, you know, in addition to the idea of different sizing of spaces and drive aisles, that kind of thing, you know, what about the idea of having a shared parking arrangement between our shopping center and our project? You know, maybe it's only for guests, maybe it's, you know, partially guests and residents to some degree. That, you know, we'd like to have some opportunities to do that. That would give us the flexibility that we would need in order to get to the number of units that makes the project make sense, right? Because within the building heights that you're talking about, we believe we can fit what works for us within that. But the ultimate constraint comes back to the parking for us.
Support that concept. I think that because the town is targeting these two very large kind of mixed use areas, the mixed uses have a different time of use during the day. So if you could, particularly if you have office buildings that are going to be 8 to 5 Monday through Friday, that is the opposite use of the residential use, right? We need night parking, we need weekend parking. So, and same for St. Mary's campus. If you have parking for students and classes, and then you have parking for residents that are living on campus, whether that's faculty or students, those uses are kind of inverted. So to be able to kind of leverage that, because of the kind of unique vision that you have for these larger areas, I think would be a saving for all the developments.
And it does work. You know, we did that in Danville. We did a town-owned community next to a daycare facility. And during the day, we dedicated around 50 parking spaces to the daycare between the hours of, 8 and 4 or something like that. Because the residents were gone. They're at work. On the weekends, they have use of those spaces. And it's worked well for probably close to 10 years now. So it's worked quite well. So that's a great, you know, it's a good idea to be able to do that, especially with opposing uses. Just on the subject of affordable units, The one thing that we're seeing is, and we've talked about being users, we mentioned a lot, it's a great idea that's being incorporated by some towns more and more. But also it's the size of those units. A lot of cities and towns are still old school that if you're going to do something, whether it be single family or multi-family, that those units must be commensurate to the rest of the market rate units, which is a challenge. So I'll just use single family. If you're building a 2,000 square foot single family home, it's some municipalities, I'm not saying Moraga or others, but others are saying, well, we want the affordable to be 2,000 square feet. The economics of that just don't work because affordable housing is not, the revenues is not pegged off market conditions. It's pegged off their affordability. And interest rate, and it's based off AMI and a bunch of other factors and interest rate. So whether you're building a 2,000 square foot 3-bedroom or you're doing a 1,200 square foot 3-bedroom, you're getting the same amount of land. So for us as developers, it's important to have flexibility to really design them as we see fit and still get the goal of delivering an affordable home. So that's a big piece. We just not walked over, but trying to negotiate a project because of that, because of the cities insisting that they be the same rate of values. It doesn't work. Interest rates, especially today, are the value of homes is dropping. So it creates a much bigger gap. So the flexibility of being able to do that is huge. Architecturally, I think as developers, we want the projects that are great, so I don't think it was an issue. But if it was finished, some flexibility to be able to finish them a little bit as well is important. Just to be able to control costs. In terms of fees and impact, it would be great to get some concessions from the cities to be able to help us on, affordable. What can we not charge the developers with? Is that traffic fees? Is that park fees? Is that other fees? School fees are probably a little difficult because you're actually loading the school a little more, but I'm sure there's other ancillary fees that could be sort of waived. That'd be important. Our consideration.
To piggyback on the fee comment, so not only obviously the amount of the fees, but the timing of the fees is a big deal for developers as well. I think a lot of jurisdictions still collect impact fees at building permit issuance when my view, and I think arguably the law is that under ABC 13 you can't collect them until the later certificate of occupancy or final inspection. So I do think jurisdictions need to come in line with that, and those impact fees are some of the biggest, huge, the big dollars, and to push those to the end of the project makes a big difference on IRR and fundraising, that sort of thing.
Yeah, just to add to his comment, right, and the cost aspects that he brought up. Just conceptually, you're willing to, let's say, BLI. Our construction costs, just hard costs are around numbers $500 a foot, whereas that selling price is $300 a foot based on the AMIs in this area. So you're losing 40% of hard costs alone. Forget about land costs, financing costs, soft costs, everything else. So given the quantum of the loss, if you can limit the expense on the fees, which Eric pointed out and he just mentioned, that all helps get to the bottom line for the developer, because that money is, it's not like it's coming out, the developer's got to cross-subsidize that with the market rate units. So you've got to make up that loss somewhere. And moving off on a bit of a tangent here, but going from the existing zoning of density of 20 per acre to 24, you're giving a 20% bonus, right? Just take with me for the math for a second, right? 10% of which is affordable. On the 10% affordable, you're going to lose 50%. But what you make on the 10% you're picking up is a 25% margin. This is a 20 to 25% margin business. So that increase from existing 20 to 24 density, you're losing money on. The only way you make money is if you force and put in the state density bonus, which says, okay, now I can get a few more and make it work. Without the state density bonus, the shift from the existing density of 20 per dwelling, 20 units per acre to 24 is disadvantageous for a developer. Okay? Mathematically, I can prove it out here. It's only when the state density bonus comes in that it helps, and then it comes to the whole thing of how do you make everything fit, and you have to probably go back to say, what am I permitted under state density, and then if I reduce the parking from what the city requires versus what the state requires, you go to that. But even that's not always a solution, because while you can do it, we have to think about the project longer term, then what will the market support? If I can build a 3-bedroom unit with 1.5 spaces, Great on paper, but who's going to rent it if there's not if they don't have 2 parking spaces? Right? You're going to tell one person to park on the street, which is okay from an approval standpoint, but from a rentability and a long-term stability of the project, it's not a good outcome. So, I mean, the state density bonus helps, but at the same time, the market has to bear what you're producing. We rely on that a lot too.
Mikhail, can I kind of piggyback on the point you just made, because it's a really important one for us, particularly the economic aspect. We've been wrestling a lot with, well, we're going from 20 to 24, it's a big increase for the town, but how does it align with what what you guys need to build a multifamily project? Like, what are you, is there kind of a density break-even point for you, a magic number, if you will, for building like a 3-story or 4-story residential buildings? It's a fairly low number when you look at it in the context of other cities. And I'll kind of open that for anybody, what densities you're seeing in the projects that you're building in other places.
30.
30.
Very flat.
Yeah.
For smaller sites in particular, the 20 to 24 is tough. Yeah, it's really tough.
I think it's going to also depend on the parking. So
Yeah.
24, we have a huge parking requirement.
So 30 to 35 starts to work, makes a lot more sense. 2024 it's really tough. And again, every site, they're not perfect squares. Every site's different. They're all irregular. Parking's an issue. In the cost of building these podiums, if that's what you're doing. And it was mentioned earlier about double-loaded drive aisles. It's something very simple, but it becomes much more efficient to do. So yeah, 30, 35 is important. I just want to sort of double back. ADUs, and it was mentioned by Dave, it is a great concept, and it's being adopted by certain municipalities. I think Danville's recently done it, and it's worked quite well. We're looking at it on another project with a different municipality, and trying to convince them that that is the way to go. And it was mentioned in one of the slides about not only having moderate ADUs, but also sort of the low and very low tier. So I'm just going to share with you some of their conversations, some of their comments, where they wanted to de-restrict, or they would like to de-restrict the low and very low, which then becomes an administrative challenge. Who monitors those renters? Who qualifies those renters? And not only that, but we did a quick market study. It actually sort of devalues the price of the home. If you have an ADU, whether it's incorporated within the home or on your property, having to be deed restricted to low or very low creates a challenge on the revenue side of it. And then who monitors who's renting if it has to be rented to low or very low? Moderate, it's an open door. It can and cannot be rented. Depends on whether you can rent it or not. But they were really struggling with, well, who manages that? Who leases it? Right. We're not going to do it. Homeowner probably not going to do it as well. So it really became a bit of an issue to where we said, well, you know what, let's forget it, we'll just write a check. Just much easier.
Okay.
Can I make a suggestion?
Please.
Since we're talking about the standards, I think that something that would be useful is really B through B all kind of work in tandem. And I often find that even if we can get the density, these standards will undercut the feasibility of the project, and we generally prefer that the city will waive them. So if the city did want to work with the state density bonus law and really leverage it to its potential, to be willing to waive these standards that often make it impossible to achieve the density that would be permissible under the density bonus, be really helpful so that we could save the concessions for things that are really meaningful. I've had cities force, and don't get any ideas, a setback concession on each side of the building, which is like ridiculous.
Yeah.
So, if I'm using one setback on each side of the building and I have too much parking, then I'm out.
Got it. Yeah, we had a whole list of standards that were up on the screen and that we had put out, and I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in on for example, the 45-foot height limit, if that's something that anyone wants to comment on, or any issues. Louis, you mentioned setbacks, but if there are any specific thoughts or comments, open space, yeah.
Height limit measured from where? Or to where?
Okay.
That's an important question.
It would not include like elevator shafts or chimneys or, it would be to typically the top of the parapet.
So, our current code includes those, so like,
So what if it's an architectural element? Would that be considered in the height? If it's a building feature that architecturally is pleasing but serves no other purpose? Would that be included in the height petition?
Well, I think that the theater currently, which is at the Ream, is, including that architectural feature, the signboard, it's 45 feet, the total height. But that's a theater, and that was constructed way back when. And I think this is like the kind of feedback that we're looking for. Are you thinking of doing like an entrance, but that entrance needs to be slightly higher? Or are you looking for more creativity so you can get a nice architectural projection that helps to fit in with the character?
Right, I make a comment about the 45 feet height, right? I think you're essentially saying if you have a podium, you're limited to a 3-story building. That's what it means. And I don't know if you can necessarily fit all the density I was talking about into within 3 stories. Especially if you go to 24 plus a 20% state density bonus. But then I guess if you go to the state density bonus, then the 45 feet doesn't apply. So maybe it's a moot point. But generally, I read the 45 feet as 3-story building over a podium.
Which is expensive, right? If you're going to build a podium,
Correct.
And you only get 3 stories.
Yeah, absolutely right.
If it's helpful, I don't know if you would agree, but I have a financial disincentive to go higher than 60 feet. I don't know if you've noticed that.
They're increments, yeah. 55 and
You get to
55.
a stair step, you cost. So it is sort of an odd kind of spot to get 45.
And I do have a question here from somebody in the audience, and it's related to height limits. The question is, with density bonus, what is the real height limit?
I would argue that, well, you can't really dictate, I guess, necessarily the design of a building as proposed to get the density you're allowed, but I would argue as a general rule, I would say, you're probably allowed at least a proportionate increase in height as you are the density bonus. So if you max out your density bonus at 50%, you get a 50% density or bonus in height. There's pretty clear law now that jurisdictions can't, for instance, say, oh well, we think you can get those 50 units by getting rid of your courtyard and all your outdoor space. That you can't do that. So you don't have to get rid of all your amenities to get that additional density. So the bonus, the height, if you have a density bonus project, yes, you can go through that 45 feet pretty easily.
Jay, did you want to weigh in on the development standards?
So one thing that is really key from our perspective, probably anybody else that's here as well, is just the path to get from the design of the project through to an actual approval and actually be able to get permits and build your project, right? Because especially in these days, interest rates have crept up very quickly. I would say they've skyrocketed. Construction costs have skyrocketed, right? So if you were planning to build a project that you designed last year, you come to today and there's no possible way you could do it with the same economics, right? So from developer standpoint, knowing what's really expected of you and what the actual procedure is going to be, the timeline, the hurdles, and that you have a path to success within a reasonable time frame. I think that's really key to know as part of the process.
Thanks.
I think if you really want to get the affordable built, you make the project by right. So if you hit your 10 or 20% or whatever it is, you take it out of CEQA, which is the other big hurdle, and you make it by right. So look, if you provide 10%, whatever it is, and you meet all the objective standards, you get to go, kind of a thing. I mean, you'll have to do that on your sites that have been in the housing element for 2 or more cycles. But I think it makes sense. That's probably the biggest incentive to really get it built.
Yes.
Yeah, so when we started the meeting, I think we framed one of the major purposes of getting feedback on the inclusionary housing ordinance that we're in the process of drafting, and we wanted to provide some time for folks to just share any ideas or thoughts, and Dave, you let us know where you stand on that. So maybe we'll have you back last, but we can maybe, anyone's feedback on the issue of how we can get it right in drafting an inclusionary housing ordinance that requires this set aside, and thoughts that you may have about all of the variables that we went through in the slide earlier.
I think Nikhil had a good point about just maintaining flexibility. Lafayette's ordinance on that bit is pretty good, I think, in that we can't see the future, and there are projects where the market shifts kind of as it's doing now, where you might not be able to sell things at the price you want, 7% interest rate world. And so those units might need to be able to switch from for sale units to rental units. So to have that built into the ordinance certainly helps. I would be hesitant to, I think it sounds like it's proposed town-wide. I would ask, well, are you charging the fees? So it's a 0 to 6, I believe, is fee only, right? Are you charging that on like an SB9 subdivision kind of thing? I think that's maybe a little rough. I think we're trying to get kind of more affordable units built here in town. Certainly I think it's right that anything less than a 6-unit project, but it's almost impossible to get a pencil on site. The fees you'll have to do presumably the Nexus 74 to adopt that. But I would consider at least maybe in the single-family neighborhoods for those SB9 projects, maybe exclude those from the fee bucket.
Eric, because you've worked in a couple of communities that have inclusionary.
Yeah, they do. I mean, it's nice to have the flexibility of making a decision of either inclusionary or using writing a check. Because again, at the end of the day, it's really running a performer for us, see if it makes sense. But to write a check, the city or the town must have the agency to be able to deploy that money to for future housing. So we're obviously in that position. I don't think they are. Just having the ability to have some flexibility is really important. As I mentioned earlier, these fees are now payable at the end of the day. That's a huge, and not a lot of people are sort of realize that, but it's a big check for a lot of these fees. So deferring that support, just having the flexibility to be able to figure out, because the market, as Bruce said, market shifting, things change. Just identify how do we want to solve that, that problem, the affordability, whether it be check or inclusion, or the type of property.
I think the options that are being proposed demonstrate some level of flexibility, right? So you have on-site inclusionary at 10%, which is a little bit lower than average, right? 15 is kind of an average jurisdictions, so that's good, right, from a market developer's perspective. You have offsite that you can do. You have acquisitions and you have land donations. So I think the big question is the value of the new fee, how you price that, which would require the Nexus study. and then the value of the land donation, right? If somebody were to say, we're going to carve off a piece of our land or buy another piece of land, what would be equivalent to their inclusionary obligations? That's kind of undetermined. And then from our perspective, we've partnered with market developers for inclusionary projects, and I think the biggest barrier to that is the tying or the knot between the two, right? So if you've got a big development that has a 50+ inclusionary requirement, and they're like, okay, we'll take that offsite, you know, a nonprofit can go do that, we don't have to think about it. But if the TCO of the marketing side is how much is the TCO of the, you know, of the affordable, then everybody's stuck, right? Because we have to go through layers and layers of financing application. And the marketing guys probably like, the market's right now, we're ready to go and we need to finish, right, and sell it. So there has to be some level of, you know, either some kind of a, I don't know, something that you can be satisfied that affordable is going to be delivered, and that the market rate is essentially has to deliver their obligation and can move forward with their project.
Right, that's so important.
Yeah, so that comes up a lot, I think. So on a bigger project, you know, where you've got, you know, a lot of units and you're trying to get it penciled out of the project as a whole, you know, a lot of cities require you to, you know, kind of evenly disperse the affordable units throughout the project. But, you know, as Felix alluded to, that really kind of screws their financing stack, because that, you know, you need to be able to put that on its own parcel within that larger project so they can get financed separately. You know, the tax credits and grants are subject to, you know, meeting a certain greater level of affordability.
We always recommend considering whether you're going to be able to get more affordable units off-site and leverage more resources. And the answer is generally 100% of the time, yes, unless it's a really small project.
Louis, you mentioned earlier you look for opportunities to build at least 50 units when you're doing an 100% affordable, and I don't know if that's your experience as well, but we're, you know, one of the things we like to think about is, oh, well, let's just do a 18-unit affordable or a 20-unit affordable project, and we have these smaller sites that, you know, is that just fantasy? Is there any way to do that?
Scattered sites.
You have to have a few of them within close proximity to each other. But just like on the construction side, you know, every site staging, there's fixed costs, right, to development. And when you break it up from 50 units on one site to 50 units on 3 sites, that costs more. And the same is true on the operating side. So, you know, before we talked about how you know, we already have reduced revenue, but there are fixed costs in the operations in that, like, we have to have an on-site manager when it's 15 units or over. So 18 units, there's on-site, 1 unit cannot be serving a low-income household. And if you break up 50 units into 3 sites, I now have 3 managers units instead of 1. You know, and then there are, you know, all kinds of like other things like that are per property that will add up the cost and then make it less feasible.
I think where it works is where it potentially works is where it's a moderate project, potentially in markets where, you know, there are areas around here where market rent, or moderate rent, I should say, is pretty close to market rent, kind of thing. So if you could do potentially do 100% moderate project on a smaller site, absolutely.
I do have a question here, which I think is timely, and I'm just going to read it out loud. What is the solution for tying the timing of off-site affordable to market rate?
I think I really like the land donation option. I have heard time and time again that it's really difficult to get financing on a market rate project if there's this variable of when you can occupy is going to be affordable. And it's under really nobody's control because we're going into lotteries essentially, competition to get our financing together. And I think it's helpful to know that affordable providers have no incentive to sit and wait. We don't get compensated until we build our projects and occupy them and manage them well. So I think that tying to perhaps a land donation or just whatever requirements were to set the stage for an affordable developer to come in and do well, I think that that's the best way forward. And set milestones for the affordable. That would be a collaboration.
I think this comes back also partly to the value of that donation. Right? So there's a cost to the market developer to have the inclusionary, to fulfill the inclusionary obligation that may or may not be equivalent to that in lieu fee. And the land donation also may or may not be equivalent to that in lieu fee. Right? So having some combination thereof to say, like, here's the land donation, it's worth $1 million. And maybe the in lieu fee would have been 2. And then the developer being able to say, here's $1 million and the land donation, it's all yours, and that is clean, right? So completes their obligation, they're off the hook, and then the affordable housing side can, do whatever it needs to get to a completion separately.
I think where it's joint, it's all on the same, it's all on the same site, it's all part of one project. I think it is helpful, and I think developers do need the flexibility as to when they're kind of released of that obligation. I think a lot of jurisdictions tie it to, well, if you gotta basically build them at the same pace as the market rate units, and you gotta sell them at the same pace. But as Louis said, it's out of the developer's control as to how they fill up, kind of a thing. And I think folks take for granted that, these units are way cheaper than market, they're easy to sell or to rent, which isn't necessarily the case, particularly on the for sale side. There have been moderates in Lafayette that have been sitting for quite a while now. So I think there should be a relief valve there, and at worst case, like, look, if the developers built all those, it's not as, and usually they're handing off, particularly for the larger projects, the marketing and lottery of those to a specialist that handles that. They should be off the hook as far as their obligation. You shouldn't, like, a lot of times, well, you can't sell your last market rate unless you sold all your affordables. When that's out of their control, really. I think if they're built, I think you've done your job.
Also, you asked a question about the chart that we have, inclusionary housing framework, and I've commented on this on a lot of this stuff before. I don't see a lot of flexibility in here because I talk about banking units, or be able to start thinking outside the box here. But first of all, I want to make a comment on single-family houses. Applying inclusionary housing on single-family developments is completely inappropriate. We don't need extra cost or impediments, and we don't need a tool to create more single-family houses. So, first of all, if you're thinking about adopting inclusionary housing, it should not be applied to single-family houses. And then we've, kind of circulated around the important discussion here is the economic, the current economic, status of, where we are here. A lot of the projects that were profitable or viable before, right now it's questionable, and I don't know where we're heading, with the higher interest rates, or, what's going to be happening to the economy. So, and then, look at Orinda. Orinda is not adopting an inclusionary housing ordinance. Their housing element says, 2 years from now, after we adopt a housing element, we'll consider an inclusionary housing. So, like I said, if we're going to be tinkering with the viability of any project that we're thinking about here, if we're going to be tinkering with it, you darn well better know every nuance and intricacy of what's happening here in Moraga. Now, I'm learning a lot by just coming to this meeting today, hearing from these other guys, okay? Because, I don't have a lot of experience, although we do talk to a lot of developers. We are involved with a lot of architectural firms that do a lot of business. But, I don't want to make a mistake. So let's set it up so we have flexibility. Let's set it up so maybe inclusionary housing is voluntary. And let's work out some incentives and take out the constraints. And some of that flexibility is, Eric mentioned it, saying, okay, ADUs, or we have, you know, if we have to have a comparable unit. You know, I'm saying, you know, a lot, you know, we can have a smaller ADU unit that, you know, if it's not the same size as a single-family apartment or condo or townhouse or whatever, allow that flexibility, you know, to take place. So I don't think we're looking at that. We're not looking at that possibility. We're already down the road where we're saying we're adopting a housing element and inclusionary housing. And I think that's a mistake. You know, just look at this. It's like foregone conclusion that Moraga's going to be adopting this, and I think that's a mistake.
I'm not a single-family developer, but I've heard that if you design a new home with an ADU, that you can do a lot split in the future and sell the ADU separately. Is that true?
No, they're not. So you can't. ADUs aren't separately alienable unless there's a very narrow instance where if it's basically built by a nonprofit, more or less. There's a carve out for that, but generally you can't. SB9 units you can sell, you can divide and still sell separately, but the ADUs you cannot.
But so you can do a duplex, but you can't do a single family that gets ADU names.
You could do, yeah, that's under SB9 you mean? You could do a fourplex or a duplex.
You can do a lot with it. Create a lot.
Yeah, I want to come back a little bit. I know Dave, you mentioned about Orinda, but I did speak to the Orinda Planning Department, and I want to just clarify that Orinda is moving forward with their housing element. They do have a policy in there for inclusionary housing, and what they're going to do is come back and adopt that policy after their housing element is done. So that's part of their work program for the next year. So that is going to happen in Orinda.
Well, I just want to add, I've read their draft housing element. Now, unless HCD has come back and say, you know, we don't like this policy, the policy does say specifically, consider 2 years after the adoption of the housing element, whether or not we should have an inclusionary housing. It's not saying it's going to do that, but it is very clear saying 2 years from after the adoption, they will consider it. And I don't know why Moraga can't take the same wait-and-see attitude.
Yeah, I think because we have the RENA numbers that we have from the state currently, and all jurisdictions are facing the same constraints from the state, is the RENA numbers.
And also, Orinda has developed affordable housing.
Yeah.
As has Lafayette, because Lafayette does have an inclusionary housing requirement. It happens to be more in their commercial area, but it's their former redevelopment agency. So Moraga's in a different position because we have not developed any affordable housing. You know, we're under the eye of
the state. We are a high resource area, and then we have not done any affordable for the last 2 housing cycles, which means 16 years total.
Yeah, we'll be
So,
planning at any
just,
housing at
you know,
all. So.
Well, yeah, thank you. Do we want to take time to read some of the comments?
Yeah, I just will say that some of the index cards have statements or comments and some have questions for the panelists. And we want to give time for everything we've received to be heard. So I'm wondering if we can put some of the questions out there and maybe alternate.
Sure.
This is trying to differentiate the statements from the. And I won't identify who's asking, but here are 2 that are statements. So I'll just read these and then maybe we'll go to a question. I'm an affordable housing developer and 6-year resident of Moraga. I'm not interested in doing development here, but I'm interested in seeing it happen. You aren't going to get scale through inclusionary housing. There should be an option for developers to pay a fee, and the city could use these fees to fund an affordable housing project. That money can produce 5 units instead of 1. The only way you're going to get scale is to use tax credits, and you need local funding to access state funding and tax credits. And that's consistent with, I think, what we were hearing. The housing element has already been established as policy, or has housing element already been established as policy? If not, every property is unique. How is this policy going to work in accordance with all of SB 330, SB 9, SB 10, and the many codes and growth requirements the state of California expects? And there may be another card. Okay, there was one question for Eric here.
Yeah, actually there's 2 really good questions. I just wanted to read them out loud. One is for Eric specifically. So Eric stated affordable single-family homes, which are smaller than the market rate of 2,000 square feet homes. How much smaller are you proposing?
I think there's a couple different solutions to that, and again, I was referring to the fact of building in like kind. So as a developer, being able to be given the option to, downsize the home. I'll give you an example where we had a single-family subdivision, and we took some of the corner lots and we made them duets with a driveway on each corner. So it looks like a single-family home. It is a duet. A little more cost effective to build, and they were, if I was going to use 2,000 square feet, those homes will probably in the 1,200 to 1,300 square foot range. But architecturally, it really kept with the fabric of the neighborhood, and people drive by today and go, oh, I didn't realize it was a duet.
Yeah.
This is a driveway on each corner. Yeah. So it's how you use the land. It's a different product type, but it looks like a single family home. So they're always smaller. Or we'd like them to be smaller, because again, the revenue remains the same. Whether you build 1,200 or 2,000 square feet on these, so it's important to adjust accordingly.
And if you place them at the beginning of the subdivision, you can't even tell.
You can't tell. I mean, it's just where you place them within a subdivision. I mean, I'll use our D'Angelo example right now, our 37 unit multifamily. Our average unit size there is probably 1,400 square feet on market, and our affordables are 750 square feet. So significantly different.
Here's a question for our panel and I think for staff as well. Moraga's added about 170 units in the last 20 years and needs to add over 1,000 units in the next 8 years. That's more than a 10-time increase per year. Do you think you're creating the incentives that will increase housing by 10 times? I think you know the answer to that one. But anyone care to weigh in? I mean, how can we amp up production? What there's some things that are beyond our control, and then there are things we can control. But anyone care to weigh in?
More, I mean, if you want things to have a better chance of penciling, more density is the way to do it. Generally, but I mean, part of it's kind of market limited. From the Kilpin, we can, regardless of whatever the parking requirement is, you can have no parking requirement, but this is Moraga, it's kind of a trek in and a trek out. People need, they're going to be cars. I think on the inclusionary side, I think, developers aren't going to build inclusionary if it's not required, generally. So, that's why.
Yeah, it's an interesting development. All the cities are going through the same question.
Yeah.
As a city, in a town, all you can do is approve a number. The rest of it is up to the private sector to develop.
Correct.
And if the private sector looks at the parcel of land, and all of a sudden the landowner realizes that it's being upzoned, the greed factor kicks in. Right? Well, my land's worth this much more now. It doesn't work. It's economics. So, everybody has to come to Jesus on this. And it either works or it doesn't work, and it's up to the private sector to make it work. And if the land seller, that's where it starts, is unreasonable, we should close our books and move on to the next deal.
That's absolutely right. We've seen that upzoning or conversions from commercial to residential, anywhere where you're trying to incentivize housing, that is really captured by the landowner. The landowner will get an appraisal and say, well, now you can put, instead of whatever, like 1-story commercial buildings here, you can put a 5-story residential building, so my value is $1 a ton. And so now all the math on our side doesn't work anymore.
Here's another one. We're hearing a lot of comments regarding flexibility. Instead of building flexible covenants into inclusionary housing framework, could we instead allow for the framework to be adjusted on an annual basis? So in other words, set up the program so that maybe the percentage changes or there are other parameters that change more frequently as the market changes. Anyone care to comment on that?
This business is any project is 3 to 5 years. Changing anything annually, you can't do business here.
So I assume then that's changing the standards, I guess, right? Which is more the town's kind of prerogative or issue. I mean, you can do it subject to your normal notice and requirements and timelines and all that. If you want to look back, and I know the state's doing this now on the housing element. Say, well, look, if you're not meeting your targets, we're going to put in a circuit breaker to make you go back and say, all right, your plans aren't coming to fruition, you need another way to get there. That kind of sounds like what the comment is getting at. I think that's fine, but it's going to be, we'll look at it as the code changes, obviously, everybody's going to look at it. But I don't know, I think that to really get things built, I think streamlining, like Felix said, any upzoning, folks are going to think that land is worth a lot more. So for things to actually get built faster and to things to get done within this 8-year cycle, you need to make it easier. You need more certainty and you need more speed.
So it's that balance between flexibility and predictability.
Yep.
And frankly, there's a lot of stuff which is not in the control of anybody here, right? It's the market. It really is the market. Like any rental building which you were thinking about 6 months ago, 1 year ago, you were thinking you could build it to a 6 cap and you'd be fine. Today interest rates are 7%. So all of a sudden, either my costs are going to come down 30%, or I can't build that project, I've got to wait for another few years for interest rates to come back as a merchant builder to be able to exit at a decent cap rate. Okay? So that's well beyond the control of anybody. And so if the market goes into recession and interest rates stay high, I don't see any catalyst, anything we do, jump-starting it to 10x the volume previously. Whoever asked that question.
And there's other factors that are out of everybody's control, such as utilities. PG&E, East Bay Mud, they're a complete disaster. We're being told by PG&E it's 19 months for a transformer on a project where I'm going to have homes finished and I don't have a transformer. I can't power the homes, I can't close the homes. So, there's that. And East Bay Mud saying, well, it's 12 to 16 months before the service subdivision. It's brutal. Right? So there's a lot of moving parts.
So one more question here from the audience. And this is about, I think, when a project gets entitled. So this question is, what are reasonable conditions of approval for the town to consider? I think that's a good question, especially when you're trying to make the whole entitlement process more streamlined for you. What conditions of approval really, I think, make it more difficult?
Well, this is completely in conflict with, build by right. Streamlining and conditions of approval is just on the other end of the scale. We're talking about discretionary approvals, the conditions of approval that the town's going to enact. So that's just, just more burdensome, more time delayed. Like I said, streamlining basically means is we don't want to reinvent the wheel every time here. We can come in with a set of plans, and if it meets the objective standards, and you've taken out all the constraints, we should be automatic approval. There should be no conditions of approval, unless it's going to, state something like, you're providing utilities or something like that. So, unless it's part of some kind of objective standard, I can't see what would be a good conditions of approval.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
Well, so I'll add to that. So,
Yeah.
it's been talked about by this panel through most of the session about uncertainty and what to expect, and then also just what other delays can happen. Like we've had in cases for projects for us where a town or a city, you have to come back 12 different times for design review because there's differences of opinion as to what looks good and what doesn't, and what fits in and what doesn't. And it's just, there's got to be a way to get to the bottom line quickly from a developer standpoint because, like everybody's been talking about, there's a million variables. And so that's, it's another one the developer can't control.
Okay. So it's 11:53, and we've been actually working with Wedgwood, so I want to give them a big shout out because Wedgwood is now running the Hacienda. And I know we're on a time, but I want to give an opportunity to just go around the room just one more time and see if there's any big insights or closing remarks that you want to give, and I'll start with Jay.
Well, I think that this session was really helpful from my standpoint because we're not affordable housing folks, and so I definitely learned a lot from these gentlemen today. And I just want to say that from our perspective, we want to improve the Green Valley Shopping Center. We want to make it improve its appearance. We want to make it more functional. We want to add a housing component to it because we think that makes a lot of sense for a lot of reasons. And so we're here to be supportive of this process. And but the key thing for us is we have a lot of other things to do in other places like everybody does. And so the more hurdles there are in any given scenario, it just makes it less likely that we're going to be focusing on that at that point in time. If there's something that is also pressing to do somewhere else where it's just a lot easier to get done with a lot more certainty in that market area. So we appreciate all the interaction, and everybody with the town has been super helpful in communicating with us and including us, and we want to keep that discussion going, and we're hopeful that we'll be able to start a project in the near future.
Thank you, that's really exciting.
Yeah, I would just say that I think the town's definitely on the right path. I think this is a reasonable proposal. I think some of the details will certainly make a big difference as to how that's working out practically. I think you hear or see articles about local control a lot in the news these days. So I think to the extent residents have heartburn over upzoning or inclusionary ordinance, I think they should realize that if their goal really is local control, these things need to happen, because if the town doesn't meet their REMA numbers, that the town will have even less control, basically. So I think it's important that folks keep that in mind. To the extent you're out of compliance, or you're falling behind in your REMA numbers, things like SB 35 coming into play, which is great for Felix and Lewis and other developers. So there's certainly an incentive to try to get, or to make it so that REMA allocation can actually get built within this 8-year timeline.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for organizing this event. It was very helpful. I do appreciate the approach of the town. I've had many interactions with the town. They're very supportive and open and looking for feedback to try to make sure something works out. I'm optimistic that I can bring a project to the city. And I think the policy is broad strokes fine. I think it's a good thing to have affordable housing. That being said, it shouldn't be in a manner which kind of limits what a developer can do, which limits projects which come to market. And I'll give you an example. Sometimes there are perverse incentives here. In one of my San Francisco projects, the city had an inclusionary housing requirement of if you're more than 25 units, if you're less than 25 units, it's 12%. If it's more than 25 units, it's 25%. So we built to 24 units, even though we could have built 29. And the reason we didn't build the extra 4 was because if I built them, I would give them all up and I'd make a loss on it. Right? So you have to pay attention to the details, because developers are very good at tracking the money to say, okay, what impacts me and how, and they build what works for them. And although the larger goal is to provide more housing, but that obviously is going to come second to them losing money. So generally I think I'm fine with it, but we should just be careful that there are not too many constraints and we have the flexibility, so you can change course midstream, you can do an in-lieu fee instead of being forced to put it on site. There's small awkward sites, depending on the product being offered. To Eric's point, that flexibility in the sizing of units also helps a lot. So generally I think this is very productive. Thank you for having it. And I'm looking forward to hopefully getting something done.
Thank you. Dave, would you like to share some thoughts?
Sure. I'm glad I came because I learned a lot from these guys, and it was nice, getting their input. Moraga is going to be enacting a bunch of new ordinances, and I like those ordinances, and it's the density bonus ordinance and hopefully the voluntary inclusionary housing ordinance. But a lot of those two ordinances will have a big impact, along with the housing element, on our ability to produce the affordable housing that the state is looking for. So I know there are certain remedies here, affordable housing, that the town is very supportive of. I like the ability and the flexibility of these new ordinances to allow not only the Berzonis but other people to utilize that flexibility to create something in their wheelhouse and something that the community is looking forward to. We have a lot of land in the downtown area. I want to see something positive built there. I want to get something developed. Frankly, I'm getting older, but the good thing is, we have the Berzoni younger generation. They're going to be here, so, we're just not here for one project and gone. We're here. We've been here longer than a lot of people. We'll be, here hopefully for a long time coming. So I want to see something positive. I don't like butting my head. I've lost my hair already. I want to be able to work cooperatively. So I'm making suggestions, because the bottom line is the state is continually ratcheting up their rules and requirements. And we've seen a lot of examples, well, we haven't, but throughout the state, there are a bunch of developers that are coming in with projects that are a lot bigger than communities thought or expected. They are coming in and they're riding on the coattails of these state laws and saying, well, guess what? This is what we're going to do. And the local communities have got to look at that and say, oh, what can we do? Is it too late? So I'm trying to work with council, planning commission, so that we can get something positive, proactive, and create the type of affordable housing that we as a community want and can support. And I'm hoping we're going to make it, but we'll wait and see.
Thank you. Louis?
I'll keep it brief. Thank you for having this. And for listening so carefully. It's a form of group therapy that when you can't buy. About land use law. And the other thing is, kind of need to find some money for affordable housing.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for having us. It's refreshing. I mean, not be totally politically correct in my next statement, but we're not the nonprofit business as developers. We are a for-profit business. And somebody asked me a question a couple of months ago at another panel and said, He said, what's the ideal percentage of affordable housing you want to do in your developments? I said, 0. I mean, that's the honest truth, right? I mean, we lose money. And actually, we don't lose money. What happens is that loss gets passed on to the consumer. And then we all sit around and complain about why houses are so expensive, right? That's what happens. So, there's a balance. We understand we live in a very, very pricey market, and we want to do what we can to help. But we would rather, as a developer, speaking from give money to these guys and let them handle it. They're the experts. They've got the wedding cake, financing available to, and sort of pass on. So that's one. 2, it's sort of a very refreshing approach. We brought projects into a couple, maybe 5-6 years ago, under different people at the helm. And I was literally sitting in a meeting, and they said, well, things in Morocco move very, very slowly. And I said, how slow? And I said, well, this could take you about 5 years. And I literally closed my book and said, thank you very much. So the visibility of an outcome is really, really important for small developers like us. There are big fish out there that they'll take on a 10, 15-year master plan. They're built for that. We're built for something that we can take in 12 months, 18 months at the outside, have an entitlement, and we can have some visibility on that. That is so important for small guys like us. It just, in 18 months, things can change, but in 10 years, that's a different kettle of fish. So, visibility and predictability is really, really important. And being able to work with staff and town council and have a little bit of entrepreneurial spirit in looking at development, trying to make it work. Very important.
And I know we're past time, so I'll make this as short as I can. I really appreciate the breadth of the knowledge that's here. I think we need all types of housing, right, from single family all the way to high density affordable. And I think from a nonprofit side, I think we're always wanting to add more housing that's available for more people. Would love to participate in this community, and we'll make sure that the housing is fitting with the context. And then the rest is like really constrained. Everything else is tied by what's available and and what things cost at that point in time. So, thank you.
So thank you. That concludes our panel discussion. I hope the audience found it helpful. And if you have questions, please feel free to email me, ahamid@moraga.com. I did bring my business cards, the brochures here, and we will keep listening to you. So please feel free to email us, and I will work with Barry.
Can we get a round of applause for our panel?
So he's going to be an important partner as we take projects through, and I do want the opportunity for you to say hello to him after we're done today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We encourage everyone to go take water, snacks.
Yeah, very nice.